Welcome. Welcome, good people. I am here. Well, first, my name is Ian McKenzie, and I'm the co-host of The Gathering of Stories, the Prism. The pandemic is a prism. And I'm joined here by my fearless co-host, Zamir Danji.
Good to be here with everyone out there.
And this conversation or this recap series came about, I think, partly because we were chatting after in the conversation that we had most recently. Our first conversation with author Charles Eisenstein felt so rich and stirring that we felt it important perhaps that we actually have a moment to reflect upon the conversation,
Yeah.
Bring out a little of what stirred for us, what's still with us. And so this is about a half hour max offering to offer reflection on that episode. And if you tuned into that episode, you are welcome to also add your comments on the wherever you are on Facebook or on YouTube, and maybe we could weave some of that in. And if you have not connected with the episode yet, I'm gonna put it in the chat box as well. So
kind of like digesting a really tasty meal, right? Like we have this big feast with the person we're talking with, and we're like, oh, wow, we're digesting it. We're just going to help people digest it. And the great thing is that even if you weren't able to hear the talk, we're going to, tease out some really important points that will still nourish you. And then if you find it inspiring, go back to the website and then access it.
Yeah. So how about, Zamir, why don't you give us an initial overview of that episode, just to give us a sort of taste of what it was.
Oh, throwing it on me now, eh? Okay. Yep. Well, I mean, Charles helped us to look at some bigger pictures, which is what he does so well. And one of the things that we started with was looking at what are narratives and how do they form. And then we started talking about some of his recent articles that he posted. Mob mentality and the unvaxxed was sort of the most contentious one. And one thing that he started to explain to us was really about how mob dynamics form. And essentially, when we look back throughout history, we always like to think that, oh, well, we would never repeat something like that again because we're more conscious or we're more evolved. But, what he was pointing to is that there's these archetypal forces within the subconscious, and that they will come out in times where they're provoked by the right circumstances or events. And what's happening right now with COVID, the intense pressure of this crisis, in some cases, the trauma it's even created for people, whether it's through loss of jobs or loss of freedoms, lockdowns, isolations, the constant bombardment of fear in the news. What happens is that it brings these subconscious forces up to play. And one of the things that he talked about in mob dynamics was sort of the need for a scapegoat, a dehumanized subclass that would be perfect to sort of place upon or foist upon some of the frustrations and the blame when solutions are not arising or working. And he started to draw some parallels between that and the people who are declared to be the anti-vaxxers. And he started to touch on that. I don't know, Ian, if you want to chime in there.
Well, I mean, it was rich territory. I mean, there's a lot of threads that we explored, and again, I recommend anybody who didn't get a chance to access it yet to follow the link and watch the whole conversation in the future. I think a couple of key points though that I thought would be useful to spend a bit more time on. One was the thread of cognitive dissonance, which Zamir, you identified, which I think is a key piece of this conversation. Just to name as well, some of the initial feedback we got on the conversation was quite moving, actually. Like I'll say that I think I'd almost characterize, or I'd almost feel some of the responses that were really appreciative. It it said that just having the space where they could actually name that level of cognitive dissonance, of which you can maybe speak to in a second.
Yeah.
But like this intuitive sense of like something's off. Like, and I don't quite know what it is, or the stories that are put forth that say this is what it is, maybe aren't as satisfying either. Like, you don't have to go all the way down certain rabbit holes into quote, conspirituality territory, just to know that for a lot of people, it does feel off, right? And to not be able to have that space to say, hey, this feels off, and I don't know where to talk to because you're immediately labeled as, quote, anti-vaxxer.
Well, that's what he said. It's part of the mob dynamic approach as well, which is also that, we tend to want to go along with what this sense of conformity with what other people are believing. And the more that we speak out against it, the more uncomfortable it is when it goes against the mainstream. And this can exist on both sides, right? People might be, looking at the viewpoints of anti-vaxxers and see where it gets a little bit extreme. And they're trying to say like, hey, you know what? There's certain things that I stand in that may be aligned with you, but I don't necessarily agree with the entirety of that viewpoint, right?
Mm-hmm.
And they happen on both sides. And this is where cognitive dissonance can start to kick in as well.
Mm. Well, I'd love for you to share a little bit of a story around your time working in a magic shop, I believe.
Yeah. So I'm just going to give a little definition here of cognitive dissonance. It's a term for the state of discomfort when two more modes of thought are contradicting each other, right?
Mm.
And they can include, a perception of contradictory information, and it filters into your actions, your feelings, your ideas and beliefs, okay? And the story that I was telling Ian is I remembered after this talk with Charles that my first job application when I was in university at NYU was for a toy store called FAO Schwartz. And it was hard for me to find a job with this particular skill I developed, which was magic, sleight of hand magic. And I got in at a pretty decent level, enough to go to apply for this job where I would be able to sell magic kits in this play store. So I go in for the interview, and as I'm sitting there in the interview, the guy's explaining to me, okay, this is what the job's about. He tests out my magic abilities. He says, okay, let me tell you how you're going to be really good at selling magic tricks. He says, you got to create something in the customers called cognitive dissonance. Okay, this thing that I just explained to you, which is the state of discomfort where two or more modes of thought contradict each other. And he shared with me, when I have a customer, how I give them a sense of what would happen if, say, if they're buying this magic kit for their child, what would happen if their child got this kit? And what would be the benefits? They would grow in self-confidence. They would learn skills with their hands and how to be able to communicate with people. And then how this would then, lead on in their life to make them more better off when they're doing presentations at work or in university. And then what would happen if they didn't develop this skill set, right? And what the consequences might be of not having that. And when that person walks away, they're now going to have this sense of, wow, wait a minute, maybe I do need to get this, right? Because my values say that this is what I want for my child, and this is how, I think that, it would be beneficial to them. And there's this sense of, now, if something's being offered to me that can help to realize that, then it would be silly for me not to go and to purchase it. And so as they're walking away and they're processing this, very often they'll come around and they'll come and buy this magic kit that they actually didn't really need in the first place. This situation of conflict was never in them, but now that you've put it in their mind, the dissonance will cause them to go back and to potentially purchase a kit. I thought, wow. There's no way I'm working for this company. And so I didn't take the job, even though I really wanted it, because I couldn't bear the thought of, manipulating people. And this is something that is known and something that is practiced, right, in the corporate world, in the political world, and something people should be aware of, right?
Well, it's interesting too, because when I think of my understanding of cognitive dissonance, particularly around sort of, I know they call it different realities, without being too esoteric, is that, when you're presented with alternate information and you have a certain existing worldview or a certain belief structure, that it actually asks a lot to be willing to step outside your existing belief structure to let information in.
Yeah.
Because there is a disposition, and I'd say like a natural disposition in humans, in our ability to connect within our existing peer groups or social groups, to maintain a certain level of shared understanding. And so the cognitive dissonance there is often experienced as very uncomfortable. And so one has to do either two things. It has to either collapse reality back into their story that they understand, because it's too difficult, right? And then from there on become somewhat more impenetrable to information or possibilities outside of that worldview. Or they're willing to actually consider that other possibilities might be true as well. And therefore need to, in some sense, relinquish that, fortified belief structure.
Can you
So,
tease that out as an example of how that shows up in the current climate with COVID?
well, I mean, one could easily apply that though to the sense of, again, essentially this trust in the medical system, or trust in the medical, rational, intellectual, demythologized story or mythology that's presented. That again, this is a virus; it's just happening. We need to make war with it until it's totally wiped out, and then humans can continually strive triumphantly into the future. Is sort of the crystallization of the dominant story. But then, as soon as one cracks open the door to quote alternate theories and possibilities, I mean, it is dangerous in the sense because you immediately invite in a vast plethora of alt theories that can go quite far. But the danger, of course, is if any deviation from the mainstream is suddenly branded as, oh, that's clearly anti-vax, then you're dismissing actually a lot of possibilities that could actually be useful to invite in and to actually wonder about, right? For example, like, I mean, you could say pharmaceuticals and their shady behavior, throughout forever, and the different lawsuits that have come against Pfizer and others for selling pharmaceuticals and have had negative effects, or even just government collusion with industry. Like, all of those things are true, and yet what's asked in this scenario is that the vaccine, for example, all of the stuff about the mainstream story of the vaccine is accurate and true, and it's good for you. Like, as in, that's a bit of a strong leap of trust that in all these other ways these industries and government have not been trustworthy, but in this way, no, they're trustworthy, and you should trust them. Like,
Yeah, totally.
right. So that's a kind of asks a kind of cognitive dissonance.
And there's even very simple plain ones where for example, you go to a hospital and you see the kind of food that they serve, and it's almost poison, right? My grandfather would be in the hospital, and we would even complain to them because he'd get white bread and jello and some really poor quality meat or whatever it is. And you're like, wait a minute, they're feeding them poisons, but this is a place of health, right? And they're coming there to heal. And that kind of discomfort is there in the system, but we tend to just kind of go along with it. And that's so common, right? I mean, it happens in mandates here in BC where, the other day I was in the supermarket and I saw a woman who worked at a restaurant, and I asked her, are they doing the vaccine passport there? And she says, yeah, they are. Are you vaccinated? She says, no, I'm not. And she says, okay, but you're able to work there, but everybody who comes there has to be vaccinated, right? And she's like, yeah, it doesn't make any sense to me. Right? But yet you just have to go on as if like, well, somehow it makes sense, right? And there's lots of things that happen that we just, as we chug along trying to figure things out, we put stuff in place and rules that on the other hand have contradictory aspects to them. And there's so many areas in which this is playing out, and it's causing conflict in both sides of the situation for people.
Well, this, I'm glad you mentioned just like a direct interaction too, because I do think this is, to me, one of the hardest things is that often anecdotally, particularly around people's either direct connection to, or maybe one degree of separation from those people who have had adverse reactions to the vaccines, that it just seems like it's vastly underreported for whatever reason. And maybe there's different reasons for that. So again, the cognitive dissonance of like, but they're saying it's pretty much fine, and yet I'm hearing all these stories. But I'll say one other example I brought up in the interview around this thread in the quote anti-vax of this my body, my choice scenario, right? This idea of reclaiming a kind of medical sovereignty is sometimes what's used. And I thought it was fascinating that I had a friend was chatting, and he recently injured his hand. This is maybe about a month ago, and he had to have it in a cast. And so he shared about, he was frustrated that day because he went to the hospital. This is here in BC. He went to the hospital, and he said he thought the cast was being removed. That was the appointment that he thought was being made. But he got there, and the surgeon, came in for like 10 seconds and was like, oh yeah, you need a week. Anyway, see you in a week. And barely looked at him, didn't ask, how's the rest of your life doing, or how are you doing? Or, it just felt very faceless and anonymous, or just a statistic of like, oh yeah, this is what this is, like seeing only the symptom that need fixing or something, right? And his whole reaction, of course, of like anger and frustration, not necessarily this professional, but later on to be like, why did I just get the runaround, and now I got to go back, spend a whole day in travel? And I thought, and I said this to him, I was like, oh, that's really interesting, because that feels like a microcosm of this resistance as a whole to this large bureaucratic social institution called medical, support or medical services, depending on where you are, which again, you are largely seems to be sort of a faceless sort of symptom or thing that needs fixing. And so in that sense as well, being asked to rely upon that model or these experts, let's say for your own personal health, I can see why that this thread within this, largely within the quote anti-vax movement, is this idea of reclaim your own connection to yourself, because you know what's best for you, and like what the right food is to eat, and like again, I'm not saying it's fully 100%, but I understand the reaction to it.
Yeah. Well, what's interesting is what we touched upon a bit with the talk with Charles is really how our narrative organizes meaning around experiences that we have, right? Experience that we have in our environment, in our life, form how we see these situations, right? How we form events in life and perceptions. And that, you know, there is a type or a kind of people who've had certain experiences or ways that they live their life that make them less prone to trusting a medical establishment or taking the vaccine, right? Which also makes them more biased away from sources that are trying to encourage them to take the vaccine or to trust a medical establishment, right? And that they go both ways, essentially, right? That we have to become conscious of our biases and our experiences, right? And how they inform what we choose to trust or not trust. And both sides of the situation need to do this. And you will notice that I've noticed a subclass of people who are not prone to get the vaccine, that are not necessarily anti-vaccine, but they're also the kind of people that probably haven't been to the hospital or doctor in a long time. They're way more natural health oriented, right? They have resistances or mistrust in government authority in general, right? So, such people are less prone to be able to take in, these mainstream narratives that we're talking about.
Well, it's interesting. I want to bring up now again another example. You touched upon the mob dynamics earlier as well, and I would say overall this thread of dehumanization, which is something, again, like if anything, I think this is what Charles was warning about in the series, is that whatever the negative outcomes lead to, it starts with or involves this process of dehumanization. And I was reading an article, I think yesterday, there was some NBA player, somewhere in the U.S., I think, who came out. He was denied religious exemption from not getting the vax. And I was just reading reports about that, and it was really interesting because there was one report. It might have been, it was on like a sort of more well-known blog, a sports blog, and the author was scathing in his judgment of this basketball player. Like he literally said, "Oh, here's this player. Welcome to stupid town, down idiot street." Like all of this languaging that clearly said, any resistance to the vaccine is clearly, just stupid. You're not intelligent, blah, blah, blah. Right. And that's not uncharacteristic, I'm saying, of what gets leveled often at the anti-vaxxers. Whereas again, I see some ways a similar dynamic going the other direction.
Absolutely.
But it's very dangerous. It's very dangerous not to see that at play. Yeah. Again, regardless of whoever believes, because it also banishes, again, like what are the perspectives that are vital, or what are the ingredients that are vital for a holistic understanding of the moment.
Well, yeah. And just before we started, we'll go into this with Stephen Jenkinson, you said, but how, that if you go too far to either side of the extreme, they come and they meet each other, and you realize that, wait a minute, we're actually not that far different. So it's being mindful not to go to those extremes, because when you do, look, it brings you both into a place of conflict. And that judgment is really a judgment of something that you don't like about in yourself, just reflected in a different way, right? And this is important for us to see, and maybe we can touch upon the religious subject too.
Well, this answers the question too that you just responded to. That how is it? And this came up actually right at the end of our conversation with Charles, but was asked in the Facebook group. How is it? How does one contend with, for example, maybe they consider themselves more on the, I don't know, let's say the natural health or the progressive left in some ways. All of a sudden finding an odd kinship with the far right and, Trump supporters and this and that. And it was a sincere question. Like, how does that, how do I sit with that? And that's, I guess, in some ways what you were just responding to, and what Stephen Jenkinson had said I'd mentioned in a previous talk recently he gave. Not around, specifically around this thing, but certainly around the idea that the extremes bend back towards each other. And in that sense, I see why if the main quote middle, let's say, generally goes along with the cultural, mythological story, right? Again, I'm not saying for better or for worse. If that generally those who go along, then it's the fringes, of course, that are in somewhat opposition or resistance or skepticism, all of a sudden find themselves on the out, right? And then suddenly, again, by being on the out, find themselves kind of in kin as
Join.
outsiders,
Yeah.
right? And so, yeah, so it is an odd jostling together. And the question comes to me too, as well, is, again, the need to create this solidified core of people that are like going along with it, again, for better or worse, in a way generates the resistance of the outsiders, right? Because it's not like the amount of people that were probably loosely skeptical or maybe just unclear, all of a sudden are now lumped in with a very quote clear group called the anti-vaxxers. And they're like, wait, what? Like, I don't believe half of what these other people believe, but now I'm in that group too. And that again is a dangerous precedent to begin setting.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it can totally be the case. And also, there's times where you'd be surprised at where values are shared across groups of people that otherwise you would see as very different from you.
Yeah.
And that's what can be very fascinating, right? And I when I commented on our post that, you sometimes people are here to support or defend you, where before you might have viewed them as enemies. And collapsing those differences can be an interesting journey in what Charles kind of spoke of as humility.
Uh-huh.
Humility is needed at this time, which means to understand that other people's narrative or viewpoint comes from their experiences and their circumstances.
Mm.
And that if we were to look and say, what circumstances would lead you to see things this way, to act or speak in this way, to make you believe in this way, and maybe even why you would feel threatened when it was challenged. And the process, we can have more empathy. And if we can do that on both sides, it really helps us to have a harmonious navigation through this process, because that's what's needed, right? Conflict is inevitable, but how we adjust and deal with that conflict, that determines our evolution and maturity as, a society or as a species, right?
Well, I'd love to offer then, I know we're sort of heading to close-ish, just we want to keep these lean recaps, is an email that I received actually from a listener, which was profound, and I've shared it with Zamir as well. And I'll paraphrase a little bit, just because I think it was so captured so much of the intent of actually what the series is for. But it spoke about how there was this a couple, married couple, they're both medical surgeons, or I believe they both, are in that medical realm. And one was very much, on the side of just had a lot of questions and wonderings and wasn't sure how to proceed, by lots of experience and lots of research and all the rest. And her partner was very much on the side of like pro. We need to do this, we have to do this. That's what it seemed to be. And she shared that she had been listening to the episode with Charles, and that I suppose he was in the room or kind of caught wind a little bit and came over actually to tune in. And they both, I suppose, pretty quickly, through whatever it was that we invited into that space, suddenly found the ability to connect once again with each other, to bridge that great divide, as we've been speaking to.
She said they held hands and they cried with each other,
Yeah, they held hands and wept.
Feeling of connection.
Yeah. In this case, within a couple that, again, that's such a microcosm of so many relationships and families and social groups that have felt this great divide between them. And something in the way that we invited in that kind of conversation, that approach, created the space to find contact again. I mean, that's how I would say it. And so in that sense, I just thought it was a really great affirmation that whatever it is that we're doing here seems to serve a purpose. And
Absolutely.
privileged to be able to bring it and to hear from you who have been touched by this. And again, without needing to say that our outcome is a particular answer to these moments or to this time, but that by inviting in this prismatic approach inviting in these different people who carry different perspectives, that maybe we can maintain however we navigate these times and remain in contact with each other. And I
Yes,
think as Charles ended the conversation last time, he said, something like, maybe messy, or maybe hold the messiness well.
absolutely. Yeah. Yeah.
Mm,
One thing I remember sharing in that was my grandfather's story and his life's message of truth and tolerance, both. Having been through the partition in
mm,
India, he left what is now Pakistan, and his life was at risk, and his family, young brothers and sisters, all because of their religious belief. And he always expressed to us the importance of tolerance, and he really embodied and represented that because he saw the consequence of when that tolerance is lost and how far things can go when we hold a religious ideal, right?
mm,
And the religions today, the need for that kind of certainty in things that we don't really see or understand, and another group interprets it for us, hasn't left us, right? And that exists both in the world of science and the axioms that it provides, and also in the world of what is being called conspiracy, right? But
mm,
when it goes into conspirituality, and those needs are being met, and they're conflicting really strongly on the edges of things, and humans have always gravitated towards it.
mm,
So we have to really learn to wake up and to be able to understand how it is that we come to align with truth in ourselves. And we spoke about what truing was. And we have to be tolerant of other people's views in the process. And this upcoming talk with Elizabeth Saturis, we're really going to look at more the axioms of science and how you can also have a spiritual worldview and a scientific worldview that's
mm,
rooted in a holistic understanding of evolution and our place in the larger dance of Gaia, and
mhm,
how that mythically can provide us a viewpoint in which we can see the opportunities this situation is providing,
mm,
right? Which will be very fascinating.
mm. Yeah, thank you for that. And to say that in some ways, I think that the orbit of the conversation, or paradigms that center the human drama only, I think are fundamentally limited, actually, right? Because from within that centrality of the human narrative, that we don't see ourselves as embedded in front of a much larger story that's unfolding, right?
Yes,
Which is so much the challenge of the Anthropocene, of which this era has been called that, the era of the human. And there's
everything
something
revolves
really,
around us.
yeah, exactly, yeah. And so if we look for responses of like what's going on simply within the human realm, then we're missing such a vast territory. It's like looking through a little tiny tube at the story, and yet actually there's an entire universe out here and a
Yeah,
story unfolding that we are part of, but not
yeah,
the reason for.
yeah, exactly. And that can either be empowering in a mythic way that embraces both the scientific and spiritual understanding of life, or it can be dogmatically scientific or dogmatically conspiratorial,
Mm,
right? And we're
mhm,
trying to open the dialogue into this broader one that encourages and embraces a way forward of courageous optimism.
mm. Beautiful. Well, I'm just dropping now the link to the Elizabeth's talk in the chat. So if you are listening to this now, and we'll share it around a little bit more on social, feel free to connect. You can get a pass to the specific talk, which happens tomorrow, 2 p.m. to 3:30 p.m. Pacific. As well, you can access the Charles talk that we've already been speaking to, or also pre-purchase access to the entire series as we unfold over this next 8 weeks or so. So again, Zamir, pleasure to drop in with you.
Yes, and everyone out there.
Mm. And yeah, what a journey. Excited to continue
Maybe,
on. Chapter.
maybe see you tomorrow.
Beautiful.